We're going to continue where we left off last week. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 5. As you turn there, let me go ahead and say, honest confession, I love a movie that's an action movie, right? Give me guns and explosions, and I'm all there to watch this movie. Now, that might surprise some people because you're like, aren't you supposed to be a teaching pastor, right? But I love those kinds of movies, right? I love where, you have one guy, he's going against the odds, he's got a cool car, there's explosions all around him. But here's the thing, like all the movies happen to be kind of the same, right? Like you got one person who's angry and wants to do something, and that makes the other person angry, and they want to retaliate, and then that person, over here gets angry because that person got angry over them being angry, and then back and forth, and before you know it, like you just got one person left standing, and then you get waiting to the sequel, right? Where there's another person who's angry, and that right there is the plot line of every Liam Neeson and Keanu Reeves movie, right? But that's also kind of the feeling in the world nowadays. And what I mean by that is we live in a time where everyone is just so angry all the time, right? Like you find that people have short fuses and people just blow up over the smallest little things. And you get online and you get on social media, which is just like a hot soup of envy and anger, right? And all you see is people yelling at each other all the time. And I don't think we all like it. Like I don't think an angry person likes being an angry person. And maybe that's some of you. Maybe you're like, yeah, I'm an angry person and I love it. I love losing my temper. I love screaming at my wife and my spouse or my husband or my kids or my coworkers. I love it. Like that's not the general attitude that we have. Most of us usually have the opposite attitude of thinking, yeah, this is not a mature way of responding to things. And if we recognize that an aspect of maturity means how to process our triggers, how to process our anger, how to process through those things, then I think we would all have to agree that we don't see a lot of real deep maturity nowadays. You get online, and like I said, and you see a lot of immaturity, a lot of anger issues. And so if we're going to talk about this good life that Jesus offers for us, and he's walking us through in the Sermon on the Mount of his vision of what life with him looks like, of course he's going to have to address this. And we looked at this last week where Jesus kind of gives this big opening line. He stops, he's like, let me tell you what my heart is all about. My heart is to see your redemption. My heart is to see a transformation that happens inside of you. And so we begin a portion of the Sermon on the Mount known as the antithesis, where for the next 6 weeks he brings up a number of different case studies. And he's going to bring up these 6 things that are very prevalent in his day and age. And he stops and talks about what God's restoration looks like in these spaces. And the first one is anger. And so if you came in this morning and you're like, oh, I lost my temper on the way here, or I lost my temper yesterday, or I know I'm an angry person, you might feel a little uncomfortable today. All right? And I don't want you to feel like I'm judging you or shaming you. I have my own issues with anger. We all do. But if we want to be who Christ has called us to be, and we want the life that he has made us to live, then this is an aspect where we look at okay, does Jesus have something good for us here? And I believe he does. And it's going to be an uncomfortable journey to get there, but that's oftentimes how that God works, pulling out the thorns in our heart, pulling out those pains and wounds that are causing us to get so angry so that he can make us into something new. But in order to begin that journey, it begins oftentimes with prayer. And so I know that every single one of us in this room, maybe I've already triggered you with some things this morning. Apologize if that's the case, but I know every single one of us have something that we need to bring back to God. Because maybe even talking about the subject of anger makes you think about someone who's treated you with anger, or maybe someone who just fires up that anger inside of you. And so this is a great opportunity before we hear the words of Jesus to bring our hearts back to him so that our hearts feel free to hear what he has to say. So I want to invite you right now to bow your heads and pray with me to get right with Jesus before we hear what he has to say. Jesus, you don't sugarcoat things. You take some gut punches with the things that you say, or you give them out, I mean. And today may be like that for some. I know I'm one of those. But your words are the word of life. And because we believe that, we're offering you everything and everyone that's on our hearts. Because we come in and we're all carrying some weight on our shoulders, some stress, some worries, some things that got us frustrated or angry throughout the week. And we come into this moment and we're asking Jesus, would you please give us a sense of peace? Help us to process through these things in a safe way where we are transformed a little bit more into your image as you work your restoration in our hearts right now. It's in your name I pray. Amen. So we are in Matthew chapter 5. And Matthew chapter 5 is the beginning of the famous Sermon on the Mount. And we've walked our way through it. We've crossed over past the introduction portion. The introduction portion, Jesus starts off with the Beatitudes, talking about the people that God is wanting to invite into his kingdom, into his fellowship. And it's not the people who have everything all together. It's average human beings. It's many times people who feel like they're exhausted, like their tank is empty, like they feel like the world is against them. And what Jesus is saying is like, you're exactly the kind of person that God wants to work his new plan of redemption and restoration through. And he called them salt and light, meaning bearers of God's faithfulness. The people that God would say, hey, you're the one I'm telling my story through. And then we looked at last week where Jesus kind of stopped and he kind of addressed some public opinions of himself. And he addressed that his heart was to see the scriptures and their intentions, their goal of shaping us into people who know God, who love God, who are more like God as we walk in our image of being made in the image of God. And Jesus is saying, I want to see that happen. I want to see God work his restoration and redemption starting inside of you. So now he starts off with the beginning of the first area that he believes that God's like, what if you want to be part of this fellowship in this community, what it looks like. So verse 21 is where we're going to be jumping in this morning. It begins like this. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder. And whoever murders will be liable to judgment. All right, so this verse begins a transition in the Sermon on the Mount. I mentioned this a minute ago. It's known as the antithesis. So 6 times, Jesus is going to bring up, hey, you have heard that it was said. And he quotes an Old Testament passage from the book of Torah, or from the Deuteronomy, Exodus, and Leviticus, and all that, which is known as the Torah. He quotes it and says, you have heard this teaching. Now, he quotes it. He's not just referencing the verse. He's also referencing the popular teaching of the day. So he's basically saying, you have heard all the teachings about don't murder, which you can imagine probably doesn't have a whole lot of teachings. Just don't do it, right? And it's easy to say, well, I'm a good person, right? Because I haven't murdered anybody. We've all heard that excuse. And that was kind of the teaching of the day. Well, if you could just do the right things and avoid doing the wrong things, then you will be right with God. But we looked at that last week. That doesn't make you right with God. That you can do all the right things and avoid doing all the wrong things, and you could still be wrong with God because you never got right with him. And that was the teaching of the Pharisees of the day. They're like, man, if we just do the right things, if you could just make sure you don't cross that line of murder, you will be good with God. But Jesus is going to start a little bit of attacking their teaching in some ways when he says, you've heard this teaching. And he follows up and says, but here's what I'm going to teach you. And here's what he says. And this is where it gets challenging. Verse 22. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. Now, these words are harsh and they're challenging, and he's driving a stake right at the heart. He's making a point that you can't just do the right things if there's a problem within you, because remember, it's so easy to be like, man, I'm good with God because I haven't done this thing. I haven't murdered anybody. But Jesus is interested in addressing the heart of what goes on behind the situation, what leads into that situation. And according to Jesus, You can be all good if I haven't harmed anyone physically, I haven't murdered anyone, but in my heart there's a problem there. And we've kind of tracked that throughout this year in our various different sermon series. We looked at that with Cain and Abel, where God was like, there's a problem in your heart, Cain. If you don't deal with this, it's going to lead to disaster. And well, it did, because he murdered Abel. We saw that with David and Saul, that many times that people kept trying to talk to Saul and said, Saul, there's a problem in your heart. You're throwing spears left and right at David over here. And now Jesus, he's kind of using the same language in his texts and his words that are making you to remember those stories and talk about what's going on. And because there's a progression here, there's actually two progressions. The progression of anger in his words, but also the progression of judgment. So let me talk to you about the first one, the progression of anger. And let me use a classic male example because I'm wise enough to say I don't know what goes on in the mind of a woman, all right? So let me use men to talk about how anger usually progresses in the heart of a man. So for all men, I believe that in our minds are like garages where we have boxes for everything, okay? And there's always a box that's called, do I have what it takes? And every man is constantly asking himself that question. And everything we do and everything we pursue, we're constantly asking that question. Do I have what it takes to do this thing? Do I have what it takes to lead here? Do I have what it takes to accomplish this goal? Do I have what it takes to overcome this obstacle? Every guy is constantly asking that question of themselves. And we all keep a record as men of the times we succeeded and the times we failed. And so if you take a man who feels like he doesn't have what it takes to be a husband, a father, a friend, a leader, a follower of Christ. And you take that man and in that insecurity, what happens when you start seeing a man who he does feel like is accomplishing what he wishes he could accomplish? Well, then you get some jealousy. You get some envy. They get on social media and they see here's another family, another father who seems to be thriving, who seems to be succeeding, and then that jealousy and the envy just grows more and more. And you start to think, there's a problem with me. I'm not good enough. I can't do this. And then you start getting mad at other people. Why? Because you're trying to do something and all of a sudden you've hit some resistance to your will. Or maybe you feel like everyone's comparing you to someone else. Everyone's saying, well, we like that guy more than you. And a man like that, they start to get angry. And what do? They start to lash out at the people closest to us. This is where Jesus says, at a brother, meaning at the person who you think you would know their heart, who would be the closest to you, who would be your biggest ally, but no, now they're a person that you look at them as if they're the enemy. You think, oh man, they're the problem. If they weren't here, everything could be great, but look at them, and I don't like them, and I don't like what's going on, and I don't like how good they're over here doing this thing over here, and I wish I could have that, and that's how it progresses in the heart of a man. And so we start to make snap judgments, and sometimes we take that anger out on others because we're really having some insecurities over here, but we lash out in anger over here at home or at our work or our jobs or with friends because we have this insecurity over here that's not being addressed. And eventually it comes out. Eventually it comes out. You see that in the progression. See, that's what happens with anger. Anger that lives in the heart doesn't stay hidden forever. It always comes out. And here's the truth. When it comes out, it makes you a little bit less human because it starts off small. Those thoughts develop eventually into those comments and those whispers. Usually it happens with first a spouse you're making about someone else, and then your kids get involved, and then your friends. And what you're really trying to do is when you're talking about, oh man, this person's a problem, this person's an obstacle, this person's divisive, this person's an evil person, this person's the villain over here. What you're trying to do, you're trying to get allies to agree with you, but you know what they're really seeing is someone who is so incredibly insecure and is not dealing with a wound in their heart and needs to find their way back to Jesus. And if someone doesn't preach the gospel to you in that space, that anger will continue to grow and fester and become eventually contempt. And that's what the last two examples that Jesus gives, with the insults and that final comment of, oh, you're such a fool. Oh, you're good for nothing. Oh, you're an idiot. That's the last comment. It's contempt. And there's a difference. So let me explain it like this. Anger is always in opposition to some sort of resistance, most of the time. Sometimes it's actually a response to something that we look at that's like, that is wrong and something needs to be done about it. It's like when you're really moved by like world hunger or human trafficking and you're like, something's got to be done here. This is a problem. That's good anger. And we see that with Jesus when he drives out everyone out of the temple. But most of the time, our anger is not always in the best way. And anger is not good or bad. It's how it's expressed. And most of the time, our anger is always in opposition to something that is giving us resistance to our will and our desires. So think about this. Have you ever gotten angry when you were trying to put some IKEA furniture together? Right? Like that screw just wouldn't line up or the hole wasn't there and you're just getting really angry. Because why? Because there's something resisting your will. Like in our household, we've got this diaper container called a diaper genie. I absolutely hate it, all right? I have bled over this thing. It falls apart all the time. Like some of the worst things I've ever said in our household have been directed at that diaper genie. All right, we've had it for 4 years, and I am so excited for the day when my kids are out of diapers, right? My wife wants to maybe sell it. My plan is to fill it full of fireworks, set it in the backyard, and watch it go off, right? I absolutely hate this thing. I get angry sometimes just looking at it in our household, right? Right? And we all have that. I'm sure for some of you it's like, yeah, it's the water heater or it's the dishwasher or something like that, right? That's an anger that's, because there's something that is resisting your will. But when our anger is not directed at an object, but it's directed at a person, then it changes. Because when you are angry at someone, you do not have their best interests at heart. There's a part of you that wants to harm them in some way, whether that's emotionally, mentally, verbally, spiritually, maybe physically, maybe financially, maybe by their socially with their reputation. This is why it hurts so much when you know someone is angry at you, because you know they don't have your best interests at heart, that in some ways they want to harm you in some form or fashion. That's what anger is. But contempt is far worse. Because at least with anger, you get their attention. At least with anger, you know that they have noticed you, but with contempt, it's, you're not worth my time. Anger is, I want to hurt you. Contempt is, I don't care if you're hurting or dying on the side of the streets, I'm not going to come and help you. You're nothing to me. You're meaningless. And we're all familiar with that feeling. It's when you get that cold shoulder from someone, when you know someone is deliberately not listening to you, even when you've talked to them many times and they just want to pull out their phone. They're like, making it very clear that they want you to go away. Or they're only listening to find that one thing so they can quickly attack you and twist your words. That's contempt. And it spits on something that is a dire need in all human beings, the feeling to belong. Because with contempt, it's, you don't belong. You don't have a place by my side. You are not worth the dignity and respect as another human being made in the image of God. And here's the thing, in our world, we encourage contempt. We do. You just unfriend this person. You just ignore this person. You think, man, things would be so much better if this person was gone. If this person wasn't here. Then I could have things my way. And we treat one another like that. And we pretend like we don't. But this kills marriages. This kills churches. This kills organizations and communities when we start to treat one another with contempt. And we oftentimes hide it so easily. We hide it so easily. And Jesus is pointing a line. He says, this cannot exist. This will kill the community that wants to follow Jesus. It will kill this church. It will kill marriages. It will kill friendships. And we don't do a thing about it oftentimes. We just sit back and we're like, oh, yeah, that's how things are. And Jesus is saying, whoa, okay, don't play around with this. And so that's the first progression. But the other progression that he points out is about judgment. So it starts off with, hey, there's, anger, there's a problem that, your soul, and then it goes, and when you start insulting, now you're in front of the council, you're in front of other people who are seeing that there's something wrong inside of you when you're expressing this anger and this contempt. And the final one, he says, the hell of fire. Now in Greek, he uses a word called Gehenna. Many times the Greek word Gehenna is translated as hell or hell of fire. But in the days of Jesus, I don't think in this moment he was talking about soteriology, about what happens when you die. I think he was talking about something very specific, because in that day and age, there was an actual place called Gehenna. It was this valley right outside of Jerusalem. And in the days of the Middle Ages, we know that in the Middle Ages, it was used as a big dump. There was a lot of fire out there. In the days of Jesus, we don't have any historical records that says that it was used as a dump. It may have been, may not have been. But I think when Jesus was referring to Gehenna, he's referring to something that his original audience would have picked up on, because they were well-versed in Scripture. And in the Old Testament, in the book of Kings, there is a story where Israel, the people of God, got so bad that they decided, let's start to have child sacrifices and burn our babies in hopes that the gods of the universe will bless us. And that's what they did. And in the book of Jeremiah, God is outraged about this, because this is happening at Gehenna. And he says, man, I'm going to treat you like you have treated these babies. And so I think in some ways, when Jesus is referencing Gehenna, what he's saying is like, man, if you go around treating someone with anger and contempt, don't be surprised if God treats you with contempt as well. Which I don't know about you, is incredibly terrifying. That the God of grace and mercy, the one who gives us life, the one that we all need, I don't like the idea of him treating me with contempt. And I think Jesus is doing a little play on words and saying, hey, if you go around treating people like this, that's what's going to happen to you one day. And that's not a good place I think any one of us wants to be. And so if you read these words in light of everything he's already said in the Sermon on the Mount, where he's like, man, I want to make you into the people that God has always made you to be, this is not it. You kind of put these together and you get a very uncomfortable message. And it goes like this. I think this is what Jesus is trying to communicate in these verses, that it is impossible to live in the movements of the kingdom with contempt in your heart for another. I don't know about you guys, but that makes me really uncomfortable. So I'm going to say it again. It is impossible to live in the movements of the kingdom with contempt in your heart for another. It's impossible. That's why he's saying, unless we learn right now to be God's people, we are on a pathway towards disaster if that's in our heart. The world would say, no, you're good. You're good. And Jesus say, no, it is time to grow up, to become mature individuals. You can't brush this off, that this idea of becoming mature is not an option anymore in this day and age. But thankfully, Jesus starts to point out the way towards healing. It's going to be uncomfortable, but here's what he says. Verse 23. So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Now there's two popular translations or interpretations of this passage. The first one is, you're on your way to worship, and you think about it and you're like, yeah, this person out here, they're angry at me. They've said some mean things to me. I need to leave my worship and go and make peace with that. That's one interpretation. But I think the real proper one nowadays is the other way around, where you're on your way to worship and you stop and you recognize and you're like, I kind of spoke out of line to that person over there. I really got angry at them and I screamed at them and it wasn't even justified how I acted. I was taking, I was using them as a punching bag. And I need to go make that right. And I think that's more in line with what God is trying to communicate here through Jesus, because this makes sense, right? Because if someone came and screamed at your child, you wouldn't be right with them. It wouldn't be right for your child to go and try to make peace with an adult who screamed at them, right? No, the adult needs to go and say, hey, I spoke to you out of line. That's more in line with the heart of God and in line with the heart of every parent. So that's kind of more, I think, what Jesus is trying to talk about here is like, if you recognize, and this takes a lot of maturity, but you recognize I didn't speak in the best way to this person. I said some things behind their back that wasn't appropriate. I attacked their character, and that's not the right thing for me to do. Jesus is making a point. That is more important to fix than all the worship you can possibly give, because reconciliation comes before worship. Now you may be sitting there thinking, no, Mason, you don't understand. It was well-deserved because they did these things over here, or what I did, it wasn't as bad as what they did. But according to Jesus, you could be possibly right in your point, but if your delivery and handling that point is wrong, you're more in the wrong than they are. Which is really a big deal. Because we oftentimes give ourselves free license to be as cruel and as mean to someone else when they make us angry because they did something wrong. We're like, man, I can get in that person's face and I can chew them out now. And Jesus says, no. Because you might be right in your point, but if your delivery was disrespectful, if it attacked them, if it harmed them, if it belittled them, then it doesn't matter what they did, you're more in the wrong than them. And Jesus pointed out, he's like, that's not what his people should act like. And yet we oftentimes do in this day and age. And we can't throw out excuses of, well, they did this to me. I'm sure the guy who's hanging on a cross dying for our sins is like, oh, I get it. I get it. But Christ calls us to something more. Thankfully, right here, he offers a solution for this problem, and it's about having a heart of friendship, of going to that person, of seeking to make things right. Because when your heart is for friendship, it's not to win. And that's important, because sometimes when we come into arguments, into fights, we want to win over the other person, right? We want our opinion, our stance to be right. We want them to know they're wrong, and we want to win the argument. But when your heart is for friendship, then it doesn't matter who's right or wrong as long as the relationship is right. And far too many people have a heart of friendship. Far too many people want to have a heart to win at all costs. And it destroys marriages, my friends. It destroys churches. It destroys the community. And just saying, don't worry about trying to be right. Worry enough about, man, is this relationship with this other person going to be right afterwards? Most people don't have that heart. I want to have that heart. I hope you do too. Because that changes things when you're in an argument with a spouse, with a kid, because then or a coworker or a church member, because your heart at that moment is not to win over them, it's to build connection. It's to build peace. Now, what you may be saying, what if they're an actual real enemy? What if they're actually wanting to harm me? Well, Jesus has something to say about that in the next verse, because his audience probably threw that out. In the next verse, in verse 25, he says, come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly, I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. Now think about who Jesus is talking to here. He's talking to a Jewish audience who are living under oppression from Romans, and their heart probably was like, man, there's going to come a day where God is going to come and set this right. And for them, Rome was their accuser, and they're hoping and praying, God, you need to come and you need to just spank the tar out of those Romans over there. And they're looking for a Messiah to do that, a Messiah to lead the way. And Jesus is pointing out, he's like, guys, don't sit back and fester in your anger and think, well, God's going to show that I'm right, because you don't have any control over the future. And how God makes things right may not look right in your regard. And it may not feel right for you for a time. And he says we can't put off reconciliation. We can't put off restoration. This has to be our heart. And so we got to be people who what we can control is not the future, but what we can control is our heart and the behavior that flows from it. And as the behavior that flows from it, look at someone else and say, well, you're my enemy. And I need to win over you. And I need to beat you. I need other people to see that you're wrong. Is that where our heart is? What Jesus is talking about here is like, man, we've got to have a heart that's that says, man, my heart is for the redemption and restoration and the reconciliation of this situation. My heart is for the friendship and the connection of this relationship. Imagine if we practiced this more. Here's an easy way at home to practice this. You lose your temper. You scream at your kids. Every parent does it. No shame. But imagine what transformation you can go back to your kid and say, it was not right how I just lost it on you. It's not right how I just screamed at you. Yes, this thing happened over here, but how I acted, that's not appropriate. Because what's that teaching you? That's teaching you that only way to respond to an adult or someone else is by fear and having someone yell at you. And that's not mature. That's not an appropriate way of being treated, and I'm sorry that I treated you that way. I'm going to try to do better in talking to you that way. I'm going to try to do better and not lose my temper the next time this happens. How many of you have ever had a conversation like that from a parent? I bet all of us would kind of want that. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. Because these little things, when they're not dealt with, they build, and all of a sudden you've got families estranged, you've got churches that are splitting, you've got communities that are falling apart. Why? Because we weren't willing to say what matters most is the relationship, not who's right and who's wrong. And what mattered most was treating one another with dignity and respect. And so you can actually take this whole big idea that Jesus is saying, and we can boil it down to this. And this statement right here that I'm about to say, we can go ahead and say that this is pretty much the big idea for the next 6 weeks, because all these case studies that Jesus brings about, this is kind of this big point that he brings up over and over and over again, is how we relate to others is how we relate to God. How we relate to others is how we relate to God. This text really brings up a lot of challenging questions about our relationship with God. Do I believe my relationship with Jesus is so important that how I make others feel they belong is central to how I live? Or do I believe that my sense of belonging with Jesus is so pivotal that I'm willing to become the kind of person who can go to those I've hurt and confess my sins to them, that I have that humility to say, yeah, I'm sorry for the way I treated you in this situation. I'm sorry about how I've spoken about you either to your face or behind your back. Jesus is calling us to live by a new kingdom ethic. He's calling us to live in a completely different way where we're not pretending, we're not covering up, we're looking for healing of our wounds. And that comes through increasing amounts of humility. That comes from increasing amounts of coming to a posture and say, I don't think I was the best version of me in that situation, in that conversation, in that circumstance. But the person I want to be is more like Jesus, and I don't think Jesus would have acted that way in this situation. And so I'm asking, would you please forgive me for the way I spoke to you, the way I treated you? That's what Jesus is calling us to be people who look more like him. Now, remember we talked about in the very beginning of this series, there's two audiences. There's two people that Jesus is talking to. There are the crowd, and then there's the followers, the disciples. Remember, the crowd is like, man, we want Jesus to do all these wonderful things for us. But the followers, which are very few in number, stop and say, but we want to be more like Jesus. This is one of the ways. This is one of the ways. Which means you can take this and be like, yeah, I'm not really interested in being a follower of Jesus. And it's like, okay, this is not held over you. This is not something that you have to follow, but it's good advice. Communities would be better. Marriages would be better. Relationships would be better if you follow this advice, even if you're not a follower of Jesus. But if you are, then you got to do some deep wrestling with what is in your heart towards someone else and how you're perceiving them, how you're perceiving yourself, and how those two are blending together to maybe cause something that is not very good. And ask yourself, man, is my heart for the friendship and the connection and the relationship and the flourishing of God's blessing and thriving in this space, or is my heart saying something different that's wicked that needs to find its way back to Jesus? And this is a serious work. but it will bring about a tremendous amount of healing if we take time to do it. And it will allow us to come back into our homes, into our families, into our relationships a little bit more like Jesus if we take time to do that hard work. So I'm going to invite you to do that hard work now by bowing your heads and closing your eyes and maybe wrestling with this a little bit. Because maybe you came in this morning with some anger. And it could have been about the state of your life right now, your job, your career, your kids, all sorts of different things. But ask yourself who you want to be in this space. And maybe there's something there that you need to invite Jesus into. And so I'm going to be quiet for a moment, let you have that moment with Jesus, and then I'm going to wrap us up in a moment of prayer. Jesus, in some ways, I'll be honest, I wish you just said, hey, you've heard, don't murder. That's good. Just keep up that. But instead, you call us to something deeper because you are passionate about our restoration. And you want to see us become who God made us to be. And dealing with this feeling of anger that we oftentimes have towards our brothers and sisters, the way we speak to one another, the way we fall into the trappings of treating one another with contempt, and it's so prevalent how we treat one another with contempt. That is, we know it's not healthy, and yet it is so hard to let go of. It's so hard to let go of the offense that we have over someone, or the jealousy we have over someone, or the history of, well, you did this thing, so I'm going to do this thing. It's so easy for us to just hold onto those things, and so hard for us to let go. But Jesus, it kills so much. And I've seen how it's produced wounds in my own life, and how I've used my own anger in times to produce wounds in others' life, and it's not fair, and it's not right, and it doesn't look like you. And so I'm asking, would you please forgive me first? And then I'm asking that you would please transform us. That as a church body, we might be people who don't just preach reconciliation and restoration, but we are eager for it. We're hungry for it. We move towards it. Why? Because we believe in what you have to say. And we believe it is better to move towards reconciliation today than to wait and see the disaster that comes because we weren't willing to say, Jesus, I'm sorry. And so I know for all of us, we have something in our heart that just causes us to fester with anger towards another individual, towards ourselves, towards a circumstance in our life. And I'm asking, would you please work in us in those spaces? Because we want to follow you, and we want to be more like you, and we want to grow and mature and to become who you've made us to be. So as we stand to sing of your goodness, may we be people who practice that goodness. May we be people who embody that goodness and show that goodness out into the world at such a time as this when all the world is seeing it, especially and most importantly, you. And may you look down on us and say, those are the people who, my unoffendable people, those are my people who can go into the circumstances they're in and show the light of Jesus. Make us into that, Jesus. It's in your name I pray. Amen.